Welcome back to Mental Health, where we explore pop culture, social issues, and politics through a mental health lens. This week I wanted to talk about the idea of homeostasis. This is a concept that applies to a number of different realms, but in particular I'm thinking about how it's discussed within the realm of family therapy in particular. In that context, it can be kind of a good thing or a bad thing, but in short, it's really just the system doing what it can to return it to the status quo. So, for example, you may work with a family where the son is like the black sheep and much of the rest of the family's attention is constantly focused on their behavior and their reactions to it. And the system's base equilibrium there is in conflict. That's kind of what they're used to. That's their day-to-day. And so you'll often see that as the youth modifies his behavior and engages in fewer struggles over the course of therapy, the family system will start to readjust to sort of find a new target on which to place their ire. It's a really interesting thing to see. You'd think that, well, the problem's going away, so everyone's happy with it, and on the surface they may say that, but you'll literally see them find a new person to kind of just shift the attention to in a negative way. And that could be to another sibling, or sometimes it causes a rift in marital satisfaction where now the parents are arguing more amongst themselves. So this goes back to a previous episode I did kind of talking about change. People don't like it. It's that famous saying, better the devil you know than the one that you don't. So people will cling to a very conflicted, violent system because at least they're familiar with it. It's something they know. I see this with the homeless population here in Portland, where for a lot of these people, the issue is not that they can't get housing or that they can't find work. The resources are there. I work with programs that can, within a few weeks' time, get these people connected with all sorts of available things, from actual housing and apartments to jobs. But some of these people, genuinely, they're just so used to living on the street and the role that they play in that and how that works for them that they'd rather sustain that than to deal with the uncertainty of moving into what the rest of us may consider kind of a typical lifestyle. But this can expand well beyond just the family system into a number of much larger systems. And I feel like it's another factor that we have to consider when we're looking at social issues. So the main example I really wanted to look at today is something that just happens to be close to me, and that's the metal music scene that I consider myself to be a part of and have for a long time now. Well, I consider a defining moment the first time my friend had me push play on the self-titled Slipknot album, but I was listening to Korn on Q101 in Chicago, God, since I don't even know how long, back in the early to mid-90s probably. But nostalgia aside, it's been interesting to see how it seems like homeostasis is playing a role in some changes that have been happening within this scene on a more social level. So it wasn't that long ago that evangelicals and kind of the WASPs and the other sort of religious types and politicians were all in kind of a kerfuffle over music censorship. This was especially pronounced in the 80s with Tipper Gore largely leading a charge against kind of heavy metal music, which led to those kind of famous court hearings that I've talked about on a number of other avenues, where like Dee Snider of Twisted Sister and a number of other musicians came out and spoke in court on what they felt were the artistic merits of their music and the importance of freedom of speech. And all of this ultimately led to those parental advisory stickers that we see on albums today. This music was seen as very taboo and to an extent kind of dangerous, but largely from like external groups who weren't part of the culture, who didn't really understand. They struggled to grasp the purpose of this music, and in their mind it was about sort of indoctrinating people into violence and Satanism and various other things, which is quite largely untrue. It's funny kind of looking back to the 60s and 70s where things like Black Sabbath were considered terrifying to certain groups of people, and now that's pretty darn tame in comparison to the music that we have nowadays. So in a sense, back then, these naysayers were kind of like the parents in this family system, and we in the metal community were the troubled black sheep son or daughter, and sort of rolling our eyes and being like, yeah, okay, Dad, whatever. Like, you're not cool. You just don't get it. You don't understand me. And that persisted for a decent amount of time. But now, fast forward to 2019, and by comparison, these are all pretty much non-issues now. I mean, sure, there's still those out there that have concerns about violent lyrics in music and violent video games and so on and so forth. You'll see those articles out there. But if you look around, people are just much more comfortable with all this stuff now. It's just become normalized. People have adjusted to it over time. You see more people walking around with visible tattoos and piercings, people wearing band shirts of more kind of extreme groups, and people not really looking twice at it, not making a big deal, and openly sharing that they listen to metal music. I've met so many people now that that's just part of their day-to-day, and they may not look the part, but they're blasting it in their car, and people aren't looking at them like they're crazy people. It's just part of what's out there now. The big thing too is like, that the scene has kind of lost its edge, so to speak, when you have people like Cardi B blowing up for wearing a Cradle of Filth t-shirt on like Instagram, I think it was, and then you've got the Kardashians with that whole controversy of selling merch with like classic metal imagery on it. These things have just become normal over time, and when something's normal, it ceases to have that kind of dangerous context to it. But this kind of presents a bit of an issue for the metal community, because it's always been kind of a counterculture kind of a thing. It's like you're not my real dad kind of, like, that was part of it. It was, clearly the music is the most important thing, but there's a whole kind of lifestyle connected to it, much like there has been with punk music and various other genres, that it's more than just about the notes that you're listening to. It's about how you dress and how you go about your lifestyle. It's about being kind of dark and dangerous and maybe even a little deviant too. So what's one to do in a world where atheism and secularism are very much on the rise, and you can't go a day without seeing an article bashing the Catholics and the Christians, and they're seen as the problematic group now. You don't see too many articles talking about the fear-mongering around kids dressing in all black and having tattoos. It's mostly about the Catholic Church and conversion therapy and things of that nature, that the tables have kind of turned. But, moving away from, that's a whole other topic. But if we're looking at, okay, what's the metal community to do now? It's time for the metal community as a system to sort of recalibrate. And this is where that homeostasis comes into play. It's time to sort of elect some new naysayers that can give us that same conflict and give us that same sense of meaning. And in this case, it has become a sibling rivalry, because instead of now these outside forces coming at us and telling us how we should think and how we should act and how what we're doing is wrong, now the finger pointing is very much coming from within the scene for the most part. When shows are being boycotted now, it's usually from some far left metal fans, not religious groups. And when there's a hit piece online about a band and something that they did that was controversial or problematic or whatever, it's usually written by a self-described social justice-focused metal blogger. And since this group on average tends to scoff at religion, they need a new subject of focus too when it comes to where their outrage is going to be targeted, which in these times logically falls to our increasing political divide. I was even interviewing a band member recently, and he was talking about how there's this saying now of like, police the scene, man, police the scene. And it's like referencing a need to sort of root out supposed Nazis and alt-righters within the scene. And we had a really great discussion too about, is there value to that? What's the benefit? What are the downsides? And, is there another way? But in any case, it's our own metalhead brothers and sisters that have kind of filled this gap. We needed this conflict to come back. We needed things to be dark and edgy again. And so we've kind of reconstructed that, and it's happening again, but it's very much sort of switched the side of the aisle that it's happening from. And it's also kind of interesting from sort of a chicken or the egg kind of standpoint, if you're thinking about it. Did these musicians sense that they had to kind of up the ante in their shock value, which ultimately led to new people being upset and offended? And, you pair this with the shift in what people care about in social politics? Or did these fans just sense a need for a cause, and there was just a gap left because we're not so much at odds with these external groups anymore, and it just was this natural thing that they fell into because they didn't have these pearl-clutching wasps, so to speak, to talk back to when they questioned their fashion and their taste in music. Now, all in all, it's probably much more complicated and multi-systemic than that, than to be considered in such simple binary terms. But it's interesting nonetheless to consider how this system that we call the metal scene seems to be acting out its own state of homeostasis right now. The thing is, people like to feel like they have a role, and they get used to the roles that they play. And when those roles start to change due to natural evolutions of social structures and just general change over time, people do interesting things to maintain those roles. This also just plays into the larger point that we're hardwired to seek some sort of meaning. And they say this is actually kind of why people die earlier after retirement. You may have heard this, that mortality rates drop when people are out of the job. It's like that without the purpose that came with being in that career, their life starts to lose some sort of meaning and there's literally less to live for. And so you need to redirect that energy into something that gives you that purpose again. I've watched several great talks recently from various professionals and researchers whose overall perspective on what we call outrage culture right now is actually a symptom of how good things are and how good we have it comparatively to past generations, which is a really hopeful perspective. And it makes sense, too, when you actually look at the data and consider what they're saying. But basically, their point is that we've evolved to the point where the vast majority of people in the developed world don't have to worry day to day about survival, which is a huge switch from just, not all, in the big scheme of things, not all that long ago, where people literally had to be on it day to day to literally not die. And, obviously you may not have it as great as someone else. There's people out there who have it way worse than me. There's people out there who have it way better than me. But even those out there who live paycheck to paycheck, the odds of them being out on the street with no prospects and literally on the verge of starvation are pretty low. Even people I've worked with over the years that are in the lowest socioeconomic brackets, I'm talking really poor people with a lot of problems and a lot of adversity to work against, those people still had smartphones, tablets, cable, they wore Nikes, they had those little kid motorized vehicles they would drive around. They weren't going without. They still, again, if we're comparing this to even just several decades back, even they have it way better than some of the people who had it pretty good back then. So we've developed in a very positive direction. It's also interesting too, because this plays into why war times can be so unifying when it comes to politics, because we've got this great division between our two political groups. But in times of war, when we have this common enemy, everybody rallies against that common evil. And it's like, okay, it's all of us against them, and we can come together. And this is basically the premise of the Robbers Cave experiment, which is a very famous one where they had these groups of boys that were initially very kind of contentious with each other because they were in two groups that were purposely put into competitive situations. When they were given a common goal to work towards, they would unify and they would get along and they would come together for that specific goal. And so again, it's this ironic situation because thankfully we're not at war, which is great. And hopefully we can keep it that way. Because, nobody wants that. We don't want people to die if they don't have to. But ironically, this very good thing, on some level, arguably has some negative consequences in that our political divide is wider than ever. And I'm wondering if some of that could be attributed to the fact that we don't have this thing to sort of work against together right now. So overall, we just have more time to dedicate to thinking about other things. We don't have to think about how we're going to get our next meal for the most part. So we can ponder about things that are really kind of more superficial. And now with social media, it's given us this platform for everyone to share their thoughts on these things and those things to become viral. And ultimately, at times, we start to just manufacture causes to give us meaning. And again, that's not me putting down people that do take on causes. There are causes out there that still need to be worked on. There's still progress to be made, absolutely. But at the same time, there's these, I like the term non-traversies that come out where, it is very much we're creating a problem that doesn't maybe really exist, but it's just a way for people to kind of fill that gap and find some sense of meaning in their lives. This all made me think of, I'm a huge Chuck Palahniuk fan. I think he's one of the best writers of just ever, especially one of the best writers who's still alive today. But I wanted to quote this thing that popped in my head as I was writing this. And it's, we're the middle children of history, man. No purpose or place. We have no great war, no great depression. Our great war is a spiritual war. Our great depression is our lives. We've all been raised on television to believe that one day we'd all be millionaires and movie gods and rock stars, but we won't, and we're slowly learning that fact, and we're very, very pissed off. This is Brad Pitt if you've watched the movie version. But this is so true to an extent. We don't have this great cause to band together on. And so now we're left with all these images of, and now it's not even just being raised on television. It's being raised on Facebook and Instagram and constantly comparing ourselves to other people and other situations and how our life isn't as good as theirs to, magnified by 10,000 from what he's talking about here with the television. And that's creating a lot of angst and people are pissed off, to sum it up. So the hope is, though, that we redirect that energy and that desire for meaning into positive sources and hobbies and actual productive activism as opposed to, terrorism like happens in the book and the movie. As that's definitely something that I do not get behind. I am very much a person in valuing peace and wanting to keep it that way. But yeah, that was just an observation that's been kind of rolling around in my head since this morning. My hope really is that people just start considering this as they go about their day, because ultimately the only thing constant is change. The big push going all the way back to that family therapy example is often to help that family acknowledge the dynamic as it's happening. I'll often do this little diagram I've mentioned before where I have like these two triangles, and those two triangles represent two family members, and it's their thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors at each point. And I talk about how their thoughts are influencing their feelings, which is influencing their behavior, which is in turn influencing the thoughts, feelings, and behavior of that other person they're interacting with. And that in turn is often reinforcing that other person's cycle. And so it goes with the entire family. And I've had so many amazing aha moments where the caregivers are like, oh my God, that totally is that. So it's that name it to tame it idea, help them understand it so that they start recognizing it as it's happening. And I see that too. I'll have families come back to me and say, hey, we started to have this argument and I started thinking about that triangle thing or that family conflict cycle or whatever. And I stopped myself because I recognized that this isn't about me. This is about I'm playing out a role. We're all playing out a role right now and we need to break out of it. And so making peace with that change and developing new roles that give each family member a sense of meaning again so that they can build a newer, healthier homeostasis. That's what I'd like to see, and it's great when it happens too. I've seen some really contentious, awful situations go very well just because they finally recognized what role they were all playing, how they were interacting with one another and how they were maintaining this awful system of conflict. And it wasn't like a magical thing. They had to learn some new skills to try to do things differently, and they had to push it. And it's so easy to just fall back into routine, myself as an example too. But it has to happen because change is inevitable, and you can't just cling to this old way we've gotten used to. And that's a big thing right now too, is just people want to stay comfortable. They don't like things that feel uncomfortable and cause some level of anxiety. But guess what? The best things happen at a optimal level of anxiety. With no anxiety, with no challenge, there's no progress. Things don't get better. You don't become self-improved, and you just devolve into a mass of waste, really. I tell people all the time, in all aspects of my life, but especially the career, when I look back at the moments that I'm most proud of and that I attribute to my success in this field today and the progress I've made, it's not the really easy families I worked with. It's not the kids who loved working with me all the time. It's those parents who just shook their heads and would not speak to me at first, or cussed me out the first time we talked, and the kids that thought that they would never be able to connect with me, and that maybe even froze me out for 4 weeks before I got a word out of them. It's the families that were really, really hard, and in the moment produced a lot of anxiety for me and made my life and my job very difficult. Those are the moments that I look back on, and that's why I feel like I've moved into a position of leadership. I think if I had just bowed out and said, this is too hard, can't deal with it, I wouldn't be where I am today. So again, just something to chew on, something to think about. I'd like to see this happen on a much broader scale, especially again right now between our two political parties. Because the question is basically, how can we get these two troubled siblings to work together again towards a positive common goal? Because we don't want to go back to wartime. But we got to come together. I think the biggest problem facing especially the country I'm in right now, the United States, is this kind of cold civil war that's going on and has been growing between the Republicans and the Democrats. It's creating a lot of tension, too much anxiety, not that optimal level that we want. And so how can we find some common ground and some positive goals that we can all come together on and start to acknowledge that, like, hey, I feel this way and you feel this way. Tell me more about why you feel that way. Instead of just saying, you hate this and you hate these people and this is why, that's people are constantly telling each other why they're doing the things they're doing. Like, you can tell someone what they're doing, absolutely, because you can see it. You can be like, okay, here's what I see you doing. That's fair. But what I find unfair is that we're constantly telling people, here's what you're doing and here's why you're doing it. And it's mostly because you're a hateful person, you're an awful person, or you're an idiot, or whatever. It's always very contentious, and it just breeds more defensiveness and more division and stalemate, and it doesn't get us anywhere. People need to acknowledge that you can't read minds. As much as we like to think we do, we can't. We're not that good. Think about homeostasis as you go through your day and as you're interacting with other people, and I'm hopeful. I think there's a lot of good change that can happen if we get back into more of a positive mindset and find some things that we can work on together, even when we disagree on things, even when we have concerns about one another, because hey, we're all human. We've all got our problems. Don't throw rocks at glass houses. But I'm going to close with the words of our wise sages, Bill S. Preston Esquire and Ted Theodore Logan, in saying, be excellent to each other and party on, dudes.